Going to start there. Awesome. Well, welcome. We've already gotten to our 6th International Women in Biomechanics meeting, which is really, really exciting. And now we're almost at 500 or 500 plus members. So this group started 6 months ago, which is incredible that we've just gotten so huge in such a short amount of time. So thank you all for attending these meetings, supporting this mission. We just wanted to start really quickly. We've updated our community guidelines and they're on the website. And if you haven't signed up through the website for your membership, we now have an option to select if you are a Womxn in biomechanics or if you are a supporter or ally. So we will be keeping the Slack channel for all of our Womxn members, but we want to know who our supporters are and non-women in biomechanics and other related fields. So encourage other people to sign up too, and they can get updates about IWB. So we have updated community guidelines, just making sure we keep our discussions respectful. Everyone's been doing a great job, but we just want to make sure we have some ground rules. Basically, I think you guys have seen this before, but when we are in the breakout rooms, speaking from the I perspective, upholding confidentiality in the Slack channels, being respectful, all the things that you are continuing to do, we just wrote it down. The next thing we have is an update about Instagram and social media. So I will pass it to Sarah to talk about that.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so as I'm sure I have mentioned to everyone either on Slack or on Twitter when I've been harassing you in your DMs, we have actually a really amazing social media team. And the point of our social media is kind of twofold. In the Twitter atmosphere, we're trying to make sure that women are more present and more visible to our peers so that we can really promote this idea that we're out there and we're doing amazing work that deserves to be recognized. But the other goal that we're trying to achieve with using Instagram is to actually reach a broader audience and to try and make biomechanics more accessible to the lay audience, but also to younger women who might want to see this as a career path. And in that vein, we have 2 different initiatives that I just wanted to remind everyone of because we're looking for people to help us out. The first one is the Instagram takeover. We've done it a few times, but essentially we hand the keys over to the member to run our Instagram account for 3 days if you want, or for a week to just kind of show us what research you're doing. So if you're actually in a good position this year and able to collect data, we would love to see what you're doing. If you're willing to share that with our followers, we would really appreciate it. Just shoot us an email. The other thing we're looking to start is called Teach Me Tuesday. So we're going to use our Instagram to start kind of sharing different biomechanical concepts and explaining these concepts again to the lay person to make it an accessible resource so that people can learn more about what we do. An email will be coming out tomorrow that was drafted by Laura Hutchinson, so we can share more with you about what this is. But essentially, biomechanics concepts in a very layperson format and in a fun format for our Instagram. And if you're willing to sign up for it to help us create the content, we would love that. Otherwise, if you just have ideas about what we should be talking about, we want to hear from you. So I'll be sending out an email tomorrow to everyone. And then finally, the last bullet point is just a thank you to our members who have been helping with the social media. You guys have made this so much easier on all of us, and we really appreciate, I think as a group, I can speak for all of us, that you guys have made it a really exciting time for this group to kind of be out there and be promoting. So thank you guys.
Thanks, Sarah. One other update, I think Paul DeVita is going to be joining us shortly, but if you guys haven't seen already, the National Biomechanics Day is collaborating with the International Society of Biomechanics to put a grant towards bringing outreach for women in biomechanics. So Paul will be joining us soon, and he will be available at the end of our keynote to talk about this grant if you have any questions, but we definitely encourage all of our women members to apply. One other update is that we have the Aussie IWB members getting together regularly, which is awesome. So there is a Aussie Slack channel. Feel free to join it. If you are in another continent or group and want to start your own thing, we totally encourage that. So follow the Aussies lead and yeah, have fun. Okay, with that, I would just like to introduce our amazing keynote speaker. I'm so freaking excited. We have Cara Wall-Scheffler. She is a professor and she's a professor and co-chair of biology at Seattle Pacific University. She got her PhD at the University of Cambridge and has won numerous awards and grants, including Professor of the Year, Junior Faculty Service Awards, Teacher of the Year. She's just incredible and amazing, and we are just so thrilled to have her be our keynote speaker. So with that, I will pass it on. I will stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it to Cara.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction and so much for the invitation to come. This is actually exactly what I want to be doing today, and it's really fun when that works out. So I am going to share my screen, and then we had a bit of a chat ahead of time, and really honestly, please feel free to interrupt at any time. I mean, I'm going to be talking about just some of my ideas and synthesizing some of my work and why I think women are great at locomoting. And so please just jump in at any time. This is not a particularly like methods heavy talk. So definitely if you want to talk about methods, you can ask at any time, and then I will be in the evolutionary biology breakout group at the end. And so you can also just come on over then and ask whatever you would like. All right, so let me organize my screen so that I can see you and my slides at the same time. All right, so I'm going to be talking a little bit about what it means to work within a scientific paradigm, something I'm pretty sure that all of you are familiar with and have even sort of bucked against a little bit as you think about what you want your research ideas to be and how you negotiate with trying to get something published, or with your mentor or whatever it might be, trying to explain why you think your ideas about locomotion matter, when sometimes in a paradigm it's really difficult to sort of move people into thinking about research design in a way that you think actually represents the way the world works. So I'm going to sort of explain a little bit about why I got into what I'm interested in right now, but it mostly revolves around the shape of the pelvis. And I'm a biological anthropologist. My sort of area of expertise is evolutionary anthropology. And so I'm wondering where our bodies come from and what our bodies do for us, particularly as it relates to the evolution of locomotion. So I'm going to argue that a mediolaterally broad pelvis explains some of the advantages of women's gait, and actually just of human gait and a bipedal gait generally. And we'll look at some of those, how we differentiate some of those as we go through. And again, I know that we're going to be posting this, and so some of you aren't here right now. So just email me. There's my email address, or send me a little message via Twitter, and definitely let me know what some of your ideas are and how things are going for you. So anthropologists and biomechanics, I think, approach gait often in similar ways. This is a skeleton of the Cara Wall-Scheffler Neanderthal. And this was an image I saw early on in graduate school that really inspired me, mostly because the papers that were written about Cara made a really big deal about the shape of its pelvis, the way, how different it is from a human pelvis, that Neanderthals have a different style of sexual dimorphism than humans do. And people were trying to make claims about how those differences in pelvic morphology and sort of the lumbar sacral morphology, the shape and rotation of the femur, and male and female Neanderthals don't show the same things that we show. And nobody ever argues that female Neanderthals don't do really well at walking. So these sort of got me interested in how we make claims about shape, the shape of bones, and how we move from the shape of bones to making claims about whether or not a creature is going to be a good walker or not. And this is an illustration to kind of emphasize for those of you who have thought a lot about lumbosacral morphology. Here we have an illustration by Joanna Cameron, where on the left, we see the orientation through the midline of the Cara pelvis. We can see sort of the anterior orientation of the pubis bone. We can see the slightly different location of the sacrum, and that's going to actually change potentially our center of mass for Neanderthal bodies. And then that's juxtaposed with an anatomically modern pelvic bone. And so this sort of idea that you can have dramatically different morphologies in the pelvis and be able to make claims about how this creature that's now extinct might have walked really got me interested, and I think sets up a number of things that we care a lot about when we're creating our musculoskeletal models that are walking on our screen and we're trying to represent reality. If we're going to change, what variables are we going to change to make a reasonable gait? So sometimes the approaches of both anthropologists, and I'm going to say actually particularly anthropologists, and sometimes biomechanics oversimplify what's actually happening in reality. Kind of like when you were in high school physics and you were told to pretend that friction doesn't exist, right? That happened to all of us. What is it with this world without friction? So here we are looking at, this is not a Neanderthal pelvis, this is an Australopithecine pelvis. The most famous Australopithecine individual that many of you might have heard about would be Lucy. And so we have an Australopithecine-like pelvis with its with the femoral shape that we believe goes with Australopithecines. And Australopithecines have wider ilia, potentially a longer femoral neck. And so we're making these sort of simple additive models. Wide pelvis plus long neck equals bigger moment, equals more energy, equals a less efficient or economical gait. And then we're going to say with living humans, potentially, I don't think this anymore, but a more narrow pelvis, a shorter neck potentially leads to less energy during the gait. So it's the sort of 1 + 1 = energy that I also was a little bit suspicious of, because there's a lot of things that happen in gait besides angle plus angle. And so this oversimplification led me to have some worries, particularly within a paradigm called the obstetrical dilemma. So for those of you who have your cameras on, thumbs up if you've heard of the obstetrical dilemma before. Okay, that I wasn't so sure. That's why we're going to talk about it for a second. Wunderschön, fantastic. So in the obstetrical dilemma, which you find in a lot of different literature, you'll find it in evolutionary anthropology, you find it in obstetrics, you'll find it in locomotor biomechanics in some papers. It's an idea that because females have a pelvic outlet that is shaped to fit not really a head, really shoulders of a infant primate through, an infant human through, that this shape right here means that women's bodies are compromised in locomotion, because a wider pelvis, and this is like a set of leaps, a set of oversimplifications, that a larger outlet means a wider pelvis, means a larger moment, means more energy walking, means a less effective walking gait for women. And that this is an evolutionary trade-off, a burden that successfully reproducing women have carried through the millennia, okay? And you can sort of see here the larger outlet for women, the smaller outlet for men, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm going to talk strictly from a locomotion perspective today. There are other researchers who have spent a huge amount of time problematizing what this might mean actually for human childbirth. Probably nothing, actually. But that's for other people. I'm also going to not talk too much about at the moment, though I would love to talk about it later, that this shape here is actually not correlated with the shape, size, or width of your ilia. Okay, these are independent in human morphology. So just because you have a wider outlet through which to give birth to large shoulders, that doesn't necessitate in a body that it has to also have larger ilia, a longer femoral neck, any of those things. They actually don't go together. Okay, there's a huge amount of flexibility. I think, as probably everyone on this call knows, there's a lot of ways to be a person. And so these things do not necessarily go together. And we'll look at a couple of examples of that, but I also wrote a book about it. So I feel really strongly about it. And there's a lot of data. All right. So the obstetrical dilemma paradigm then exists for a set, this idea, again, the obstetrical dilemma paradigm that women are not good walkers, okay? That their style of locomotion, because of this evolutionary compromise, means that women's walking costs more energy, is a less effective gait, okay? This paradigm exists for a number of different reasons. First and most importantly is that we forget that the pelvis doesn't walk by itself. It exists in an entire body, and this body can take on lots of different forms. And we know about this for two main reasons. One, from the evolutionary record. So here's our friend Kabara that we've already seen. This is Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi, which are two other now extinct bipeds. And they had different shaped pelvises, for sure. They had wide ilia, they had differently shaped outlets. They also had different lumbar curvature. They had different styled feet. They had different lengths of their lower limbs and slightly different formations of their knees. They also lived for hundreds of thousands of years in a really difficult environment. And so we're going to suggest that they probably managed pretty well in order to live longer than we have currently lived on this earth. So the pelvis can fit lots of other styles of body architecture. The second piece would just be human, typical sort of standard human sexual dimorphism. In any given human population, females are about 10% smaller. It doesn't have to be this way. Other apes don't have this kind of sexual dimorphism. Some apes have even more. We know that size differences are a function of numerous different selection pressures. Ours tends to fall at about 10%. That means that women, regardless of the shape of their pelvis, always have a higher surface area to volume ratio than men. And this is going to be really important for how women manage their heat. And so maybe you can have some wiggle room with your pelvic width because you're not building up as much of a heat burden because you're smaller. On average, always on average. I'm 5'10", so I mean, you know, there's a give and take here, and we're always sort of dealing with averages. Also, this is really important, I hope, for all of you. Humans are not geometrically similar. And so, like, we can mix and match the shape of the pelvic outlet with the ilia, with the femoral neck length, with the length of the femur. We mix and match all sorts of different geometric proportions, which is why you go through all the effort of measuring the inertial properties of every limb that you're looking at, right? Because they vary. And if you really want to know how something is swinging, you have to measure the limb that you're interested in. Right? You want to take the time to do your DEXA, right? You want to know what the density is because it varies. Again, it kind of depends on what your question is, but we know that humans do show quite a bit of variation. And so we're not going to just make assumptions. So the pelvis, regardless of its shape, is existing in this body that has lots of other stuff going on. So obstetrical dilemma, problem number one. Problem number two just goes back to my very initial concern, is that when we oversimplify variables, we lose some of the resolution of our interest. So like I just mentioned, if we forget about physiology in our excitement about physics, then we are going to lose some of the things that can happen to make a gait really effective. How are we able to get rid of our heat? How are we able to swing a limb? How much non-muscular tissue do we have doing work for us? There are things that are happening in a body that is more than just the length of the limbs. So we want to think about those. And I love head, arms, torso bouncing along on a pogo stick, but the arms matter. The rotation of the torso matters. Whether or not we can angle the body to get a slightly longer stride length matters. And so again, these simplified models are wonderful for setting up hypotheses, but they're not that great if you're trying to understand how evolution works. Okay, and that's one of the pieces that I think is really important for when we're living within a paradigm. What was the purpose of the paradigm in the first place? And so let's try to figure out if we can problematize it and build on it a little bit. And then my final point for why I started being really concerned about the obstetrical dilemma is that we often neglect what we call in evolutionary anthropology, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And if you ever took a cultural anthropology class at some point in your life, you might have talked a little bit about human universals. And I'm just going to take a second because I've been chattering for a little bit now. Can anyone think of a human universal? What would be an example of something that all humans everywhere in the world do?
Breathe.
Yeah, breathe, eat, lose baby teeth. Do you know that different cultures have different fairy tales for what you do when your teeth fall out? Yeah, we tend to not marry our siblings. People tend to use baby talk. Baby talk is about as close to a universal, so that sort of sing-song habit, oh, you're so blah, blah, blah. Actually, every culture does that. That's interesting, right? And so, whereas when we measure often in our labs, people on a treadmill, walking or running at a speed that we've given them in athletic clothes so that we can fit markers on their joints and see them, and then try to extrapolate this into this set of human universals, we come up with a problem because this is the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. This is a sculpture of a Homo erectus woman crossing the savannah with her kill, with her impala. And so there are things about her posture, there are things about her load, there are things about her body that are slightly more difficult to replicate or understand on a level motorized treadmill. So again, we want to have controlled experiments. How much do we want to extrapolate from those experiments? And so now I'm going to show you another human universal. This is just the pelvis, not actually walking by itself. Here's the pelvis walking. And so here's my second sort of breakout question for you. What are some things you observe in this suite of situations that I'm illustrating for you here?
And Cara, there's some comments in the chat, so it looks like load carriage.
Definitely, they're all carrying loads. Absolutely. They're all different ages. So that's something they don't have in common. They're all outside. Okay, they're all outside. We know that that matters. They're walking up hills and over terrains. We know that that matters. There are trees in the background, water in the background. They're mostly barefoot. We know that that matters. They're not always carrying kids though. And that meant I only have one example of a woman who's pregnant, this woman right here. So it's not just that you're pregnant. That's not, I mean, we're probably going to say that we would be extinct. The loads are on different positions. Yes, I love it. Absolutely, the loads are differently positioned. I think that that's really important. There's more than one load. Okay, and every single human population that I have ever read about, 100% of them have women carrying loads. Sometimes kids, sometimes not kids. in different positions, always on their shoulders, on their heads, on their backs, on their fronts, on their sides, in their arms. And so this is something we always see. So if this is part of our environment of evolutionary adaptiveness because it's a human universal, which is often how we begin to build those kinds of models, then we need to do a better job of understanding load carrying. And it's not just about giving birth, right? That's like a couple of hours, give or take, depending on who you are. It's about getting that load in the first place, right? Getting that load in the first place. So this is the environment that I really began investigating the more I read about the obstetrical dilemma, and the more I thought about if women everywhere in the world are always walking and always carrying loads, how can they be bad at it? Because we'd be dead. We would be extinct if they were really that bad at it. It's just, that's how evolution works. So they have to be able to do it with a reasonable amount of energetic efficiency or we'd be done. All right, so that's going to take us to some data. That might have been too long of an introduction, but I hope that we're okay. I was told when I was a postdoc that you really shouldn't have more than 5 minutes of intro before you leapt into your data. So sorry, but I'm leaping into my data now. So hopefully that's okay. So we're going to go for just a second into energetics land. I know that Anna said that a couple of you saw the talk that I gave at ISB in 2019, where I was in the dynamic walking group. And so I know that many of you do know quite a bit about energetics, but I'm just going to take a second for those of you who haven't thought a lot about how we talk about energy, what some of these terms are going to be and why I think they're interesting. These are real data, which is why it counts as a transition between introduction and data, okay? So we're going to talk about the cost of transport curve, which is where those of us who bridge biomechanics and energetics spend a lot of our time. So on the x-axis, you see that I have speed, and on the y-axis, you see that I have cost of transport. I'm usually going to talk about cost of transport, joules per meter. I'll do a little bit of joules per stride for a couple of reasons, but this is interesting both from a biomechanical perspective. We think that cost of transport is so interesting because it helps us determine what kind of behavior people might engage in. And we care about it a lot from an evolutionary perspective because usually people are going to something. They don't get on the treadmill and say, I'm going to exercise for 20 minutes. They say, I'm going to the berry patch to get the berries. I'm going to the well to get the water. And so we often are thinking about things in terms of distance. And so that means that the cost of transport, the joules per meter, tends to give us something that has an ecology associated with it, which helps put us back into that environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. So here is the cost of transport curve for walking. You can see that there is a curvilinear relationship between cost and speed while walking in all humans, regardless of their task, regardless of whether or not they're walking on a level or an incline, or regardless of whether you collect these data on a treadmill or walking around a track, it pretty much always looks something like this. And there are three variables that I care a lot about. The first variable is the actual amount of energy, the actual speed at which people tend to walk to minimize energy, because that gives me a conceptualization of how long people have to walk in order to get to where they're going. We call this the optimum speed because this is the speed at which people can walk and use the smallest amount of energy. And I say it like that because if some of you are engaged in non-human locomotion, the optimum speed is often not really about energy, right? It's about getting prey, or the speed at which you can rotate the fastest, or have some sort of level of maneuverability. And so I think calling it the optimum speed, when it's simply the speed at which energy is minimized, is something kind of peculiar to humans. And we do that because we walk a lot. We do a lot of steady state walking, And because we do a lot of steady state walking, we do tend to think that energy is something humans are interested in minimizing. Then we want to know, so the optimum speed is again the speed at which energy is minimized, and the actual cost is the minimum cost of transport, the actual energy that is being used to walk at this speed. And we can add up, if you're going this many meters, how much energy is that going to cost you? So we're going to compare and contrast the minimum costs of transport with men and women, with different pelvic morphologies, with different styles of biomechanics, to see if there are ways that we can minimize how much energy we're using. And in evolutionary land, we care about this because when we minimize energy for locomotion, something that we do a lot of every day, that means that our bodies are able to allocate that energy to reproduction, which again matters from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, we don't necessarily live in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness anymore. And so you're freed a little bit from some of these constraints. But when we're studying them, we're really interested in these constraints. The third variable is the curvature. And so the curvature is really interesting to me and has been interesting to me for about 15 years now, because it tells you how constrained people are around their optimum. Okay, so this is the curvature to which I am referring. If you have a flat bottom of this curve, that means you can walk a little bit faster and a little bit slower and actually incur absolutely no energetic penalty for doing so. Okay, and so it frees you from some of those concerns about energy, and it lets you do a lot of different kinds of tasks, walk with different kinds of people with no energetic burden at all. If your curve is acute, then all of a sudden, the moment you try to walk outside of your optimum speed, you incur an energetic penalty for doing so. And so one of the things I think that's important for those of you who are in the dynamic walking group is this idea that we're never going to move outside of optimality. That's so bad for us, et cetera, et cetera. It's not equally bad for everybody, and it's not equally bad for every single task. And what we see is when we ask people to make choices, is that people make choices about how fast or slow they're going to walk, really actually based on the acuteness of this curve. The steeper the curve, the less likely people are going to choose to walk away from it. The broader the curve, the more likely we are to see behavior have some flexibility as well. So the curve is interesting because it helps me predict behavior in different environments. So these are the three words and ideas that we're going to be looking at as we compare and contrast the effectiveness of women's walking. So I have spent a lot of time watching people carry loads. And as you all noticed from those images, I've had people carry loads all over their bodies, walk indoors and outdoors, on flat surfaces, on hilly surfaces, through forests, over beaches, sand, cobbles, asphalt, pretty much any sort of perturbation that I've been able to get IRB approval for, I've given it a go. So here are some things that I have found, and I'm going to try to differentiate for you again if there are men and women in these samples, and if there are samples just of women, et cetera, et cetera. So this study, we have men and women. Men are always going to be blue, and women are always going to be green in all of our slides. And here we have speed again on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have cost per stride. And these are data of men and women carrying the same load. And that's another thing that I know is pretty interesting to many of you, whether or not you're going to have your participants carry an absolute load, in this case 11 kilos, or if you're going to have people carry a relative load. And there are pluses and minuses to doing both of those. It always depends on what your question is. If you have to carry your kid, you're not going to put your kid down because they're not the right percentage of your mass. If you're going to pick up the bag of mangoes, you're not going to leave a mango behind because it's not quite the correct percentage. But on the other hand, sometimes we really want to compare tasks. And so there are reasons why you might compare relative tasks to absolute tasks. So in this case, our females were absolutely smaller and carrying the same amount of mass. They were doing the same task. And as you can see, for the cost per stride, females were significantly, almost 50%, using 50% less energy for carrying this 11 kilo model. When we looked at cost per distance, because there are differences then in speed, females are still using significantly less energy to do the exact same task. And that's because they're lighter, right? So even though they're having to use a larger proportion of their skeletal muscle in order to carry and do this task, because they're still absolutely smaller, they're going to be using absolutely less energy. And we see that also they were wearing mass evenly distributed around the center of mass. They were carrying mass on their shoulders and then carrying the mass asymmetrically on their hip, kind of like you're bumping the mat, out on your hip. And again, females significant, this is just minimum cost of transport. And so these women have an absolutely lower minimum cost of transport all the way across, regardless of where the mass is located. Again, not particularly surprising, but still really important to understand when we're talking about evolution, you're giving someone an absolute amount of food. And so if you're able to do the exact same task for substantially less amount of food, then you're doing a good job from an evolutionary perspective. You're still a good job. But what people often argue when they're pulling these data back into the obstetrical dilemma paradigm is that that's all well and good to be small, but men and large bodies are still more efficient because their cost per kilogram should still be less. And shouldn't that be what really matters from an evolutionary perspective? And so this is sort of a classic drawing in anthropology. Many of you might have seen this in sort of an animal physiology class or a comparative, sort of an Andy B. Winner type animal locomotion book or something at some point in your reading history, where you see the large gorilla being in the Cadillac being more efficient, the amount of work for per kilogram, essentially. And then this is a mouse lemur. So a teeny tiny little sort of 2 kilogram lemur from Madagascar, and our VW bug being more economical. They're doing absolutely less. And so you can sort of weigh these and say, well, maybe being economical is okay under certain circumstances, but thank goodness we still have these large bodies to be more efficient. And so I then took this particular idea where comparing and contrasting women's economy with their efficiency by dividing by their mass then to get their efficiency. And actually there are no significant differences between men and women in their efficiency while they are carrying a load. And so women are economical, absolutely using less energy to do this task, but they're not losing any of their efficiency to do it. And so that's then kind of surprising because our expectation when we're comparing efficiency and economy is that these lines will switch places, that they will be basically the exact same percentage apart, but just in the other direction, where men will be that much more efficient than women. And sometimes on an unloaded body on a treadmill, you will see that. Okay, you will see that. You will see these lines switch places. But here in this study on a loaded body, we don't see that. We see that women have exactly the same efficiency despite their smaller mass. So we're going to take a look at how the pelvis in a body, not walking by itself, in a body might contribute to some of the efficiency, at least, given that we think that the economy is primarily paid for by being absolutely smaller, having less mass on average, and having this a better way to get rid of heat with the lower surface area to volume ratios. So if you haven't thought a huge amount about the pelvis lately, I'm just going to remind you of a couple of measures. So here, if you're just looking at it, so here is the pelvis, the ilia, the ischium. Here is the femoral head, and then the femurs. And so this is going to be the greater trochanters here, and then this is the iliac crest. All right. And so when people measure the pelvis and make claims about childbirth or walking, they often just measure the biiliac breadth, which is from here to here. As I've already said, this has absolutely nothing at all to do with giving birth. Nothing. It's completely not only independent of giving birth, it's independent from the measures. It varies in a different way than your outlet measures down here. But anyway, it potentially has something very important to do for locomotion for a reason that we're going to talk about. So these are the ilia, and this is biiliac breadth, and then these are the greater trochanters, and this is bitrochanteric breadth down here. And so bitrochanteric breadth, you can see, doesn't necessarily have to do about the pelvis, but we often make claims about it in terms of the hips. Okay, and so when we're measuring the pelvis, we're going to use these two measures. The further out the trochanters are, theoretically, the longer your femoral neck, potentially. And it's, as we're going to talk about, it also potentially gives you some advantages when you're rotating your pelvis. So if you just take a second to kind of think about where you put markers when you are measuring torso or pelvic rotation, just think about whether or not you put them on the ilia. You could put them on the anterior superior iliac spine. That tends to be pretty common. That's good. You can put it actually on the iliac crest itself, sort of more laterally. You can also, depending on what you get your participants to wear, can put them on the greater trochanters, and that gives you, and they're different measures. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to suggest to people when they don't just say pelvis or don't just say hips, because these have different functional capabilities during gait. And they also they're not always the same. People can have sort of a large ilia for their body mass or for their stature, but not actually have particularly wide trochanters. So again, we're not geometrically similar. And so just because you have a larger measure in one area does not mean you're going to have a larger measure in both. So think about what your question is, and then take your measures based on that. So I'm going to talk first about bitrochanteric breadth. So here's our jaunty walk. And we're going to talk for a second about data on bitrochanteric breadth and how it helps us. So if you have a relatively wider bitrochanteric breadth, and this is for your stature or your mass, usually these end up being about the same. So if you have a wider pelvis for your stature, then you have a lower cost when you're walking. And this is walking not on a treadmill, out and about. You also can carry a load for less of a cost. So the cost of adding a load to your body goes down if you have a relatively wider bitrochanteric breadth. And if you put that load in your arms, so that your arm carrying your load, then you also have a faster optimal walking speed if you have a relatively wider bitrochanteric breadth. And I'm going to tell you why in just a second. So these are patterns, right? These are energetic patterns. Now, biiliac breadth is also really important, but it seems to work in a slightly different way. And so by iliac breath, it increases speed, flexibility while carrying asymmetrical and front loads. So if you, so that broader base for the optimal walking curve becomes significantly broader when you have a relatively wider biiliac breath. So it increases your speed flexibility. Again, another human universal is that people tend to walk with other people. And so because we're not geometrically similar, being able to switch around your gait actually ends up being super important for how you maintain social cohesion. You have to be able to walk with other people. And so if you have a relatively wider biiliac breath, you're able to walk with other people at other gaits and not incur any energetic penalty for doing that. It also increases speed flexibility while walking on inclines, and it decreases overall the energetic cost for walking up a hill. So how does that work? What are some things that we've come up with so far? So in terms of bitrochanteric breath, almost every single study that has looked at this has shown that as your bitrochanteric breath increases, your stride length while carrying also increases, and that people with a relatively wider bitrochanteric breath who are taking longer strides have the lowest cost of transport, and that the more narrow pelvises with the shorter stride lengths have the highest cost of transport. And we have looked at this both in terms of just morphological differences among women. Those are here in black. And then these 3 studies looked at populations with both men and women. And I just want to say really straightforwardly, we haven't separated men and women in these studies. We've separated humans with relatively wider pelvises for their mass and relatively more narrow pelvises for their mass. And so it just happens that on average, women have relatively wider pelvises for their stature and mass in humans. But of course, we're not geometrically similar. And what we're trying to understand here is body shape, not just issues of gender, which of course are super interesting and important, but we're also looking at these other pieces. So in all of these studies, we're looking at relatively wider for your mass or stature, not just like, oh, you must have this kind of body because of your gender. That isn't what we're looking. We're looking at, again, shape and function relationships. Okay, so we think with bitrochanteric breath, what's happening is that as people become loaded and they rotate their body to accommodate this load, the increased width of the pelvis is getting them to swing their leg a little bit longer. And so they end up getting their leg length plus their pelvic width and end up with a slightly longer stride length. And this seems to be, I mean, we've now shown this over and over again, and we have a couple more studies that are about to come out. So it has been strongly repeatable, the bitrochanteric breath. Biiliac breath has been pretty interesting. And most claims about biiliac breath have to do with stability, with if you have a relatively larger pelvis, then you have more bone and more muscle mass lower in your body, and therefore have a lower center of mass, creating a more stable person and a more stable gait. And these are some of you might know that again from YouTube physics, that experiment where women and men put their head, they bend over and put their heads against the floor and then try to lift the chair. So just looking at these differences between center of mass. So, and if you've ever gone to like buy a backpack from REI, you know that we do have some sort of differences. And we think that lower center of mass that women have really does matter, that women have on average, but we also see, of course, across, that seems to matter for for stability. And so lower center of mass, just based on first principles, I've shown that it increases the efficiency of the adductors, which might lower the total amount of energy, particularly going uphill. So stability on hills is something that's going to be important. I'm just finishing writing up a paper that shows that that having a wider biiliac breadth does actually lower the step-to-step variability. And so we do think that there's something pretty over unstable terrain. So we do think there's something pretty important about the ilia for stability. And then there have been tons of other really great papers just perturbing stability in a variety of ways, and thus showing how having a more stable body decreases the energetic cost of gait. So in sum, the broader hips, either by the ilia or by the greater trochanters, help us increase our stride length, which reduces our cost of transport. We take fewer steps to go a given distance. It increases our stability, so we have less step-to-step variation, which can increase the cost of locomotion. And it increases the effectiveness of gait cycle timing, which is something that I would love, love, love more people to look into. If you look at these two humans walking, at these two models, can you tell me which of these is a man and which of these is a woman?
I would guess the left would be a woman because she's shaking her hips more. That's just, or if they are.
Yeah, she definitely has more lateral rotation for sure. I mean, the left is a woman. On the right, and we didn't tell them. I mean, this was actually a study I did when I was a postdoc at UW-Madison, and they're just walking on a treadmill, right? I didn't tell them to do anything, but their gaits are different, right? Their gaits are different. And so if you're going to look at average muscle activity, probably you're not going to see that many differences. But if you dig down and actually look at the differences in timing, then you begin to start seeing that there are some differences. And my hypothesis was that, okay, if you're going to say that the larger moment arm necessitates a larger amount of muscular activity, what if you use that activity really wisely? What if you use it right before the collision so that you don't have to spend all of this extra energy rebounding from the collision? Make the collision less impactful on your gait. And that's actually what we ended up finding, that people with a relatively wider bitrochanteric breadth do have a larger moment of muscle activation, but then they don't have to rebound from the collision in quite the same way. And so this is how we can explain some of these energetic patterns, because we're taking the pelvis in an entire body and using it in a slightly different way. And the end result is a more effective gait. Okay. But you really have to problematize the models that you're given in order to pull this out. Okay. Okay, take a message. So women are both economical and efficient walkers, and people who have relatively wider hips get a lot of these benefits too. It's not just being a woman. They use absolutely less energy to walk, and that's usually because they're absolutely smaller across human populations. They can take longer stride lengths for a given lower limb length. Again, this really only pops up when there's a load involved. You don't typically see this on unloaded people on a treadmill. So there's something else about adding that load that seems to get this additional rotation and the longer stride length. And they can shift their biomechanics based on their morphology. It's a whole package. We often also are going to see this, for example, when women do decide to become pregnant, we'll see some kind of cool biomechanical shifts with their gait during that time. So, and it's always, as I just said, task dependent. What are they carrying? Where are they carrying it? And some of you might know that I wrote a really fun paper about how carrying groceries is different than carrying a kid. And so it's not just the mass itself. People walk differently when they're holding something they care about. And this is just something that is worth remembering again when you're designing an experiment. It's not just 10 kilos is a 10% increase in cost. That's not what it looks like in real life. So it's important to sort of recognize what you're asking people to do. Okay, here are all my amazing students in all of our different venues. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Cara. That was amazing and so much great information. So often we, I think in general, have heard from society that, you know, being a woman, having wider hips or whatever is not efficient. So this is totally turning it on its head, and you gave us so much research tips to think about too. I am so grateful to you for being here. I would love to open it up for questions. It looks like there's a few in the chat. So I can read them out. So Steph asked, have you looked at muscle co-activation with wider hips?
Tell me a little bit more about what you, like which muscles are working together when with wider hips. Not specifically. I mean, in the particular study I showed you, we had 8 muscle groups, but I didn't specifically look at which were trading off exactly which time, but that is that's a fantastic idea. That was also unloaded walking, and I would 1000% like to look at it with loads because of the fact that we tend to see this shift in pelvic rotation and getting this longer stride, like specifically wall load carrying. And we have to know what's happening at the level of muscle activation to understand why that is. So yeah, I think that that's a great idea.
And I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Ed.
Thank you. Great talk. Thanks so much, Cara. I had a question. It kind of relates to something I think Jill put in the chat about assistive devices. I think this is a really interesting kind of area to explore a bit more. So I guess looking back at the way we kind of evolved and some of the assistive devices that we may have used, have we seen much evidence of men and women using assistive devices differently or different types of assistive technology to carry loads?
Oh, what a fun question. So yes, there's actually one of my favorite papers looks at one of the, I'm really interested in the fact that women hunt, but we never talk about it. And one of the reasons that we haven't done a good job of understanding how much hunting women have done is because women and men do tend to use different tools. And so when we're trying to understand what a hunting tool looks like, everybody always looks to men's tools, when the reality is that though women have a different toolkit, they're also using them for hunting. So yes, there are different cultures do different things. That is not a universal. In some cultures, women make the carrying tools for men, men make the carrying tools for women. In some cultures, everybody makes their own carrying tools. In some cultures, the men will make the baby carrying tool for the person carrying his baby. And so there are different things like that. I've looked at nets. I've looked at how simple a sling can do. That's actually my very next study is, does a strap do as well as fabric? Because we definitely see textile differences. There have, of course, been a number of studies on people using jugs And so they're carrying the load in a jug and thus they're balancing it versus people, and that tends to be women who tend to use jugs and baskets. Men, again, it kind of depends on where you're going, tend to use bars, and then sort of balancing weight either in front or behind or on either side. Let me see if I have an actual study. I think most of my studies have been either using a tool or not using a tool. Not necessarily looking at if in Papua New Guinea, they tend to use nets, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, they tend to use slings. And so I've sort of written a preliminary IRB on that because I think that's a really important question, but I haven't gotten that all the way through. But in terms of using a device versus not using a device always saves energy 100% of the time. And it can save energy depending a little bit on where you put the device. But I mean, here's this actually is another paper I'm writing up right now because I think this is an interesting idea. Even if you keep the device constant, but rotate the mass around your body, the energy moves a little bit, but it moves because your gait changes, not necessarily because of the device. So when people are carrying mass in a device on their back, they always walk faster than if that same mass in the same device is strapped to their front. And so because there are these sort of trickle down effects, it's difficult to pinpoint it exactly on the device itself, and just these other things that are going to happen when you move mass around your body.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And one thing that's kind of really interesting there is that we're good intuitively at kind of working out strategies to carry mass and building our own assistive technology, essentially. Yeah. But when we go into the lab, this is a huge challenge for us to kind of create devices that will help alleviate some of the metabolic penalties associated with low carriage for soldiers and things like that. So yeah, very interesting. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's worth going to museums and actually looking around at how people, I mean, that's one of my favorite things, is just how have people managed and what have they thought of and how could that work for us today? Yeah, cool.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Jill, you had a question in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to talk about it or if I can read it out, but.
Yeah, so my question was related to when doing locomotion studies, you'd be better at characterizing basically the apparatus of the system, such as identifying mass. I think you said greater trochanter width, if I got that right, and leg length perhaps, or something like that, rather than just lumping people into gender boxes.
Yeah, I would actually love it if I saw more papers which actually measured greater trochanteric breadth and used that instead of just gender. Because I mean, it's fluid, so it's not really necessarily that helpful of a construct for us right now. But there are some things about bodies that can tell us a huge amount about the purpose of gait and how gait is going to change with tasks. So yeah, I think that would be fantastic. And I mean, you can do it in there are so many interesting ways to do it. I often create a regression line so that I can explain and show. So if you have your regression line of mass and leg length, or mass and greater trochanteric breadth, and just sort of say, in this sample, because humans have an infinite amount of variation. So in this sample, half of my sample is above this line and half of my sample is below this line. And I'm going to look at their different activation patterns for these different morphological groups. That's definitely.
I think it's really interesting. I do a lot of work in sport. And so, people often find themselves, we don't have 7'5" gymnasts for a reason, right? These kind of things. So part of it is what the system affords, right? And what is can be controlled, especially whatever the demands of the task are. But there's some really interesting things in categorizing body morphology as it relates to who ends up in different sports. So that might be of great interest, especially as you try to find the people you want to study, that you might find sport participation is a way to find them and then work within the geometry after that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually did that with one when I was trying to get a really big sample. And this is when you study human evolution, there are fossil hominins that fall. Oh, sorry, they're doing construction outside my office. I'm so sorry. You often find that there are certain now extinct populations that fall within a certain subset of all of human variation, because humans are the phenotypically most diverse biped on Earth, right? And so in order to be able to extrapolate to creatures that are now extinct, you have to have a pretty good sample in order to say the variation of, you know, Sediba is within the variation in my sample of humans. And so that's exactly what I did. I went to our gymnastics team and I went to our basketball team, and I was like, I need the coaches to give me permission to have everyone walk around a track for me, so I can have my 4'10" to my 6'10" humans. And that was, I mean, it's delightful. When I lived in the UK, of course, I was told that the reason that proper football is the best sport of all is because it's not so morphologically restrictive. You can be any size and be an incredible footballer. So, because my husband is a basketball coach, so they were like, oh, basketball, so phenotypically constrained. But anyway. Can I isolate the effects of gender from the effects of pelvic width? So I definitely started out doing that because I thought that was a reasonable way to get at these relative size differences. And some of the obstetrical dilemma, the sort of birth canal ideas, seem to be constrained to women. It's just what we have found is that the size of your birth canal doesn't actually influence muscle attachments for locomotion. And so those measures aren't really making a big difference to how you locomote. And I think that there's going to be another issue that has to do with culture. The little video I showed you of the man and the woman walking, there are real differences in their gait. And some of my significance was higher when I ran it with gender rather than running it with morphology. But I think that you would have to be willing to collect a better cross. For me, at least, when I'm trying to say something about evolution, I would have to do a better job of collecting cross-culturally, because I've been told by a lot of people that like a woman's gait is really different outside of the United States. And in some of the ethnographic groups that I have used some of their load carrying data for, the gait that they take on when they're carrying a load actually looks different than their gait when they're not carrying a load. And so definitely understanding the options for gender cross-culturally, understanding the options for load carrying cross-culturally is something that I would like all of us to do a better job doing, because you walk like your parents for a while, and your parents walked like their parents, and you walk differently when you're walking in a downtown area than you do when you're walking through the park. Some of that is because we walk more slowly when we're around trees, but some of that is because we're task oriented or because there are cultural constraints on our gait. Everyone knows that teenagers walk like their friends. So I think that gender matters, but I think that if we're trying to tease apart morphology, then we need to tease apart morphology. If we want to tease apart gender, we need to do a much, much better job of selecting our sample. So, Yes. Paul, you have been waiting to ask your question for so long.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. There were a lot of data that you showed that I was surprised about and did not know. I have a couple of questions, but of course I'll just ask one. You were showing that one of the advantages to the wider pelvis is more efficiency and or greater economy. So I was wondering either what are the disadvantages or the advantages of a narrower pelvis? And I'll take a guess. Higher power output ultimately. So do you have any perspective on that for example, evolutionarily?
Yeah, and actually the answer from an evolutionary perspective, because a narrow pelvis is very rare among bipeds. We don't see it in any of the other sort of 35, 25, I don't know where we are in terms of numbers, in terms of extinct species right now, but any of the other bipeds for the last 5.5 million years, none of them had a narrow pelvis until we get to African Homo sapiens at about 165,000 years ago. So why would you want to be tall and have a narrow pelvis if you live on the equator? And I really do think that it's thermoregulatory. There are, again, I think one of the reasons you can have a wider pelvis if you're small is because you have a high surface area to volume ratio anyway. But if you also want to be tall and have long, lean limbs, then your best way to create surface area over which to lose heat and to not build very much heat in the first place is to have a narrow pelvis. And so we do tend to see that people who don't build up heat as quickly tend to have more endurance. So you can either have more endurance by being small, or you can have more endurance by being narrow. And so I think that what ends up happening is that we need to have endurance for a variety of things that make us human. Really long transport distances, really long routes of communication, ability to go far distances in order to exchange ideas and gain access to resources. And so I think that the narrow pelvis, if you're also going to be tall, really helps with that. I think there probably are some things, as you're suggesting, about power output. Dave Carrier at Utah has definitely looked a little bit at that. And so I think there are some ways that you can look about it. But for me, when I look at the fossil record, I'm interested in the environment in which a character appears. And the narrow pelvis is so rare that when it does appear, that's really interesting. And it appears in a long distance traveling hot environment, which suggests to me that it's for thermoregulation.
This possibly relates to some of the ideas about evolutionarily humans were able to track down animals after long distance running. Isn't this the theory? Maybe this is Lieberman, perhaps?
Yeah, that's not my theory for running because it's not a human universal. So definitely not. But I think endurance movement is something that humans do well. I just don't think we're running. I mean, we run today because it's super fun, right? But I don't think that's what we've evolved to do.
Thank you, Cara.
That's actually my keynote for ASB this summer. So if you're excited about running and how we didn't evolve to do it, but it's awesome now, then that will be my lecture then. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Cara, that is awesome. We recently did a book club and we read the book Joy of Movement. Have you read this?
No.
Tell me about it. So
okay, I'm writing it down.
Really fun, Joy of Movement, and yeah, Emily recommended it for us, and we had a great time reading it and talking about how fun it is to move. So yeah,
it is so fun. And wheels, right? Wheels, so fun. Didn't evolve to use them, but they are amazing.
Awesome. I think Jasmine has a question in the chat. Do you want to share your question, Jasmine? Or yeah.
I think you're right on.
Yeah, it's not really like I guess a question. It's more like commentary on reasons like when we saw, you know, the motion capture walking, there's a reason why we assumed the left one was a woman and the right one was a man, because we know that men walk like Gaston and women walk like Belle, right? So, but that's like a societal thing where it's like, act like a lady. Like there's a reason why there's etiquette classes and those kinds of things. And we may not, like, I don't feel like I walk like a lady, but maybe I do. And like, like subconsciously. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And I totally agree with you. Part of the issue is that I think that we develop a good pathway for walking how we are used to walking. And so it's difficult to perturb that system without being willing to work with your participants and have them practice the gait that you want them to walk. I think that people actually kinematically can get a new gait with practice. And I think that if you were to measure their energy during that practice, you would see, in fact, some of you might, there was a really fun paper that was published a few years ago now about people doing a parkour route. And the first time they did the parkour route, they used this much energy. The next time they did the parkour route, they used this much energy. And the third time they used this much energy. And so we know that we are pretty good at finding an energetically reasonable pathway. And so if you wanted to perturb someone's gait and get them to walk in a different way, and we're willing to work with them, I think that you would see that you would be able to do that, and that you would end up finding whether or not they had a sort of whether or not it was in the difference in timing and at what point they were able to get it energetically reasonable. Yeah, within it, you know, if they were able to choose things like if they were able to choose other parts of their kinematics. But yeah, culture, very powerful. So yeah, you definitely have to take that into consideration when you're considering how, you know, what is your question? How meaningful do you want your answers to be? How big of an extrapolation do you want to make, right? Are you looking at, you know, undergrads at research one universities, or are you looking, you know, in a clinical population or whatever it might be? These are all really worth doing and interesting, but you just have to know what you're asking. Yeah, oh my goodness, yes. I totally, this is one of the things I'm really interested in, and why I think it's really great that people change their gait when they're carrying their kid rather than carrying their groceries. Because I do think that people do change, and they change. I have a study on jaywalking, trying to think about what in a city is dangerous. That idea of optimality, right? When you're crossing the sidewalk, optimality is not about minimizing energy. Optimizing your gait is about getting across the street without dying, right? Without getting hit by a car. And so people change their gait when they're walking across the street by themselves. It's different when they're walking across the street with a group. It's different when they're walking across the street with their phone. And so again, what is your question, right? What is your research question? Because these are all interesting. And, you know, I'm sure that many of you are following the story about the lab that now has gait recognition for so they have a really nice high resolution system. And when people are sort of walking into this high security area, if your gait doesn't match the gait that they're expecting, then you're dinged as an interloper, someone who's not supposed to be there. And so I've thought a lot about that, because we do change our gait. I change my gait when I'm wearing high heels. I change my gait when I'm walking into a class versus when I'm walking into the gym, right? We have these kind of like, you change your voice for when you're talking to your parents versus when you're getting ready for your job interview. And so our gait is exactly the same way as our vocabulary. So how do we measure that? How do we compare it? How much flexibility should we expect the gait to have? Because I think it is really flexible. Do we actually have with all of those variations in gait, is there one that we really do use the least amount of energy? Like, do we have a best pathway gait? And which gait is that? Right? The gait when you're walking with your parents, or the gait when you're walking with your partner, or the gait when you're walking your dog? Which gait is the one that has the sort of the most effective and efficient routine? I definitely think we should look. The only work I've seen with dancers has been about jumping and falling, like the way that dancers land. They land in a way that protects their knees. And so they've been trying to teach these jumping techniques to other kinds of athletes to minimize knee injuries. But I don't know if I've seen anything besides just measuring relative turnout. But that would definitely male and female dancers walk differently. Ballerinas in particular, yeah. Anecdotally.
Hey, Cara, a lovely talk. I was just wondering if you've looked at any other bones or if you've just focused on the pelvis, because there'd be other bones in the body where there'd be differences between males and females, or that would change function as well, right?
Yeah, that's a really, I'm so sorry about the jackhammer outside of my office. I hope it's not too disruptive for any of you.
We can barely hear it.
Oh, I'm so happy. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. So a couple of different things. When I started, I was really interested in the femur. Again, particularly because I got interested in locomotion generally because of Neanderthals, and they have a significant different, they have more femoral torsion, and they have sort of an anterior rotation that I found super interesting. I ended up really getting, for the last many years, focused on the pelvis, but I'm working on a project right now that incorporates the pelvis and femur functional unit. So I'll be looking more towards that. In regards to whether or not there's sexual dimorphism elsewhere in the body, it really does depend on the culture of the group. In some First Nations in North America, for example, the women have more robust humerus than the men because of their particular subsistence strategy, grinding. And so we actually see larger bones in women than we do in men, even if the absolute stature is slightly different. In some highly mobile groups, particularly those in Australia, we don't actually see a lot of sexual dimorphism in cross-sectional variation of the femur or the tibia because they're all walking. And when women are carrying loads, again, they're carrying the same amount of mass, even though their overall body size is smaller. So you kind of have to know what type of, sex variation you're looking for, because it, especially when it comes to the bones, it pops up in so many different ways and isn't necessarily as, it doesn't always follow the pattern of stature, I guess. But no, for the first 20 years of my career, it's all been about the pelvis. But I'm definitely looking towards other bones now, but again, still in this sort of locomotor functional area.
No, it's very interesting. I'm more of a foot person, and I think there might be some sort of link between the pelvis and the foot, because both structures have a lot of influence on medial lateral stability, and I just wonder if there's a relationship between the structure of the pelvis and some of the structural differences or variations that we see in the foot as well, but I don't know.
So yes, and so you are going to want to read Jerry De Silva, and his actually, if you have a moment, a page, I see that I can copy a file into the chat, but there's actually a paper about Australopithecus sediba, written by Jerry De Silva and his student, whose name I'm really sorry escapes me at the moment, but that's exactly what they looked at, because Jerry is a specialist on feet, and the sediba pelvis is really peculiar, and the foot shows some lateral pronation that he got really excited about. And then it ended up that the pronation significantly changed the lumbosacral morphology. And so it's actually a super, you know what, and it was actually in paleoanthropology, which means I don't even have to find the exact paper in my very busy computer. I can just find it online for you and put it in, and put the link in, and put the link in the chat really fast, and then you can read it, because it sounds like it will be a really good fit for your interest.
Thank you. I'd love to read it.
Good. Okay. Is there another? Let me see when Ben.
Yeah, I haven't wanted to stop the discussion because it's been so great, and you guys have all had such great questions. If you're able to stay on, we'll keep going for maybe another half hour. Feel free to leave at any time if you need to, but this has been so great.
So no breakout sessions, Anna?
Yeah. I can start the breakout sections, but just saying, it's been an hour and a half, so I do understand that. I can get that started actually. And actually I'll thank Cara one more time, and I will also stop the recording so you can